Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for turning out for this Conhome panel in partnership with CPRE. As the title says, we're going to be focusing on land use today. Between homes, energy, food, infrastructure, and the natural environment, there are lots of growing and often competing demands on the countryside. So we're going to be looking at ways that the Conservatives might be looking at land use framework or other things to balance these competing needs. So we've got a fantastic panel here. We've got Robbie Moore, who is an MP and the Shadow Minister for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. We've got Roger Mortlock, who's the Chief Executive of CPRE. We have Lizzie Hacking, who's the Chair of the Conservative Rural Forum. And we have Daisy Powell-Chandler, who's Head of Energy and Environment at Public First. I think we're going to start with some opening remarks, and we'll start with Robbie. Thank you very much.
Yeah, great to be on the panel. Look, I suppose the opening remarks need to really focus on what our intentions are with land use. We all know that land is a finite resource. No one's making any more of it, and therefore we need to have a proper, honest conversation about how we utilise land, and therefore how we set a clear agenda going forward with clarity in terms of making sure, in my view, that food productivity and food security is at the heart of government policy thinking. We have a land use framework consultation that is taking place, being controlled by DEFRA at the moment, and that worries me because it is setting a direction of taking about 18% of land out of UK food production, opening it up for other things like housing, energy security, biodiversity offsetting, nutrient neutrality and other issues. But it is setting a narrative alongside all of the other budgetary decisions that have been made by the Chancellor so far on things like IHT, removing de-linked payments for our farmers, removing the opportunities associated with sustainable farming incentives, creating more headaches associated with cash flow pressures on our farming businesses, to do with creating clarity and certainty on how we are going to have a streamlined policy agenda on increasing food productivity. There's a lot of anxiety, as we know, out there amongst our farming community at the moment, and the land use framework consultation, even though it is controlled by DEFRA, in my view, is not providing that clarity and that certainty that we need for food productivity to be at the heart of government thinking.
Thank you. Roger, would you like to?
Yeah, sure. No, so we're 100 at CPRE next year, and there were two things that were in our founding mission. One was the conservation of what is beautiful, seems to me very conservative values writ large there. And the other thing was, perhaps they never put it like this, but as George Michael said, if you're going to do it right. So the right development in the right place. And I think those things are particularly core for us, as Robbie said, that we're facing sort of conflicting and sometimes competing demands for land. There was a fantastic, if anyone hasn't read, there's a great Royal Society report that came out in 2020, and it said if we carry on as we are with all of the demands that we have for land across nature, for farming, for agriculture, we'll need a third of the size of England again to meet just England's land demands. So we're going to have to work differently. We have to think differently. We've got some pretty hefty targets, as well as the food security targets that Robbie met. We've got a pretty hefty, we've signed up in successive governments to a pretty hefty nature target. We were delighted to support the previous government's local nature recovery strategies and a commitment to deliver 30% of the land in the UK for working for nature by 2030. At the moment, that figure's 7%. We've got quite a long way to go if we're going to meet that target. One of the things that worries me, just picking on that link between land and nature, is currently, we did some work a couple of years ago that showed that 60% of what is currently our prime farmland is at risk of basically being underwater by 2050 unless we begin to think differently. So out there's a real desire to think in a joined up way about land, and the other thing I just want to finish with is what currently we have isn't working. So 2/3 of mega solar is on prime farmland at the moment. In the pipeline, it's even worse. The other thing that we're particularly concerned at is the number of brownfield sites continues to rise as the number of greenfield sites continues, development on greenfield sites also continues to rise. We're not getting this right. So two things I think are critical. One is there's a a lack of join up. We've got to join up these land uses across government in a more strategic way. I have some concerns about the consultation, as Robbie said, but I think fundamentally implementation is going to be key. How we deliver this on the ground is the most important thing. It cannot be, as successive governments have talked about a land use framework being a set of principles. If it's a dusty document in Whitehall, it will deliver nothing. It has to be operationalised. I don't think that means telling farmers and landowners what to do. I think it means working with them to co-design a plan for land that helps us to deliver those benefits for people, for planet and for the environment and for our future farming industry together.
Thank you very much. Lizzie, would you like to?
Thank you. So I'm going to touch on housing and infrastructure, which can be quite polarising within the party. And I think one of the areas that we need to collectively try and take a bit of a decision on is the approach to what we believe conserving means within the Conservative Party. So I'm also a district councillor, so I see the very real impact where you have lots of people who obviously do not want their areas to change versus obviously younger people needing to gain access to housing and their own home. So I think back to the reason that our voters are getting older and older is because if you don't have anything to conserve as a younger person, which you have no stake in society or community, you don't own your own home, why would you then vote for a party that sort of represents that? And I guess the challenge we've got with rural communities is, unlike what you see on Countryfile, it isn't just a place where people can visit and it's all lovely. It is actually an area which needs to thrive economically. And rural, I think it's about 15 to 20% less productive in terms of the economy of rural areas versus the rest of the country. And a lot of that is due to a lack of infrastructure investment. I think we've all seen that. We love a pothole photo as councillors, but the reality of that is we need more money going into these areas so that businesses can thrive, so that actually you don't have to go to the city to earn your money and then be able to afford to come back when you're older. You can get a stake in your own community from like a much younger age and build your family and have your opportunities there. So I completely take the point around the greenfield sites, and I think we need to collectively look at how we can densify urban areas in a much more meaningful way so that there are opportunities to live and work where people would like to, rather than having to spill out, drive up house prices, which means that anyone on a local wage in a rural area, which we really desperately need, we can't be taking all of our workforce out, they can actually afford to live where they have their jobs. So I think I'm looking forward to balancing the challenges between actually needing those greenfield sites for housing and how we do that with nature and farming.
Thank you. Daisy.
Hi everyone. So I'm Head of Energy and Environment at a company called Public First. We're a policy and strategy consultancy. And I spend a lot of time thinking about how we should make policy and then going and talking to the public about what they want to hear from their politicians, but in general, what they want for their communities. And it strikes me that core to the conversation we're having today is the fact that, of course, both people and governments care about how we use our land. Our land is our primary resource. It is the source of our productivity, and it is also the thing we live on. So that's why we care about it so much, and that is why we already have a way of managing our land use. It's called the planning system. But what we have seen time and time again over the last few decades is that our planning system is simply not adaptable enough. The context is rapidly changing, as it always has done across history, but right now we are facing myriad threats, which include flooding and drought, as you've already heard, the change in the way we approach mining and other extractive industries. We're not using as much land for that. We are digging deeper, which has a different footprint. Farm diversification creates different needs for the planning system in our rural communities. We're also electrifying our homes and businesses at an extraordinary rate. That is a massive transition that we need to accommodate within our planning system. So how are we going to build a system that can cope with all of those changes? Well, I would argue actually fewer frameworks, but more adaptable systems are probably what we need to be looking at. And also concentrating the government's brains on how do we provide the public goods, otherwise why bother have government? We could surely all do this ourselves if we didn't need some coordination on those tricky pieces, but also creating a clear trajectory about what we as a country, as an economy are trying to achieve. And that's where a nice topical point, that's why instruments such as the Climate Change Act, flawed though they may be, do provide that certainty about what we as a country are trying to achieve over a span of decades, so that we can all begin to plan our businesses on that basis without the need for central control that says this farm will be used for X product, this bit of land will be used for Y thing. So I would argue that government should set clear trajectories about where this economy is going and leave some of the more detailed planning down to local communities whilst creating adaptable frameworks that can change as the context changes.
Thanks very much. That point that you made about leaving it, details towards local communities, it casts back, Roger, to what you mentioned about sort of co-designing a plan when it comes to land use. With the land use framework that's being sort of developed right now, do you feel like that is happening at all? And what could a good land use framework look like?
I look at it's unclear at the moment what it's going to look like, so we're due an announcement later this year. I think two things are important to us at CPRE. One is that the scale is right, so it's still meaningful to communities. So a decision about what's happening in your area is not being made hundreds of miles from you. So I think one of the suggestions we've made is that the new sort of strategic authority scale, we've lost the knack to do strategic spatial planning in this country. And it's about time we kind of regained that knack, because all of these pressures, actually we think about the impact of what's happening with climate change, with the nature crisis, with the housing crisis. We think about, we talk about that in a wanna, but when we articulate the solutions in boxes, and it's about time we started unpacking those boxes, because each of those problems need to work with the same finite group of land. And I think one thing is about geography. I think that strategic authority level, not ideal, previously done by county. So I think it's either that kind of county scale or a strategic authority scale. The second is governance. It's not about telling farmers or landowners what to do, but somehow, at the moment, not all land uses are created equal. The planning system is basically a plan for where to put houses, and if we wanted to do more, we have to fund it and resource it to do more, and we need to kind of have a strategic plan that allows it to do more. So I think the governance needs to be right, and the scale at which we make these decisions needs to be right as well.
Robbie, I mean, in your role, is that something that you're looking at in terms of if the planning system is focused around housing, do you want to see that broadened so that actually land use is seen in a wider spectrum of all these things we spoke about?
I think the thing that frustrates me at the moment is we have a direction that's been set with a land use framework consultation, which is being controlled by DEFRA, which is supposed to be coming up with ideas and solutions on what and how we should use our land. But alongside that, we've got a roadmap to farming that DEFRA are consulting on. We've got the national food strategy that DEFRA are looking at. We've got the profitability review that DEFRA are looking at just to do with food production. We've also got the planning and infrastructure bill, which is working its way through the House, which is already setting an agenda on how we should be utilising land. We've got the moratorium on onshore wind now being lifted. So we're seeing speculative development now already taking place in areas like I represent in West Yorkshire, where we have a 65 wind turbine application coming down the line on protected peatland. And then we have an announcement from the MHCLG Secretary about this whole green belt, grey belt land, which has resulted in a lot of speculative housing development now coming through, where local authorities don't have local plans adopted and in place. The point being, a narrative has been set that we're going to have this consultation process about a land use framework and set direction, but all of the things that I've just talked about is setting the direction in all different sporadic directions without actually having a cohesive approach. And that is where it is then incredibly challenging if you're wanting to have a direction that is focusing on increasing food productivity, or I dare I say for any sector, when there is not a strategic approach that has been set.
I mean, Lizzie, do you want to touch on that and the idea of the grey belt as well?
Yeah, my gut instinct generally is I just don't like the idea of the land use framework, to be completely honest. I do think we've already got too much of a culture of arm's length bodies wading in and telling farmers exactly what they should be doing, and really far more in depth than you realise. There's definitely that sense when they walk onto a farm that they feel, anecdotally, that they kind of own it, and the farmer is forced to sort of go along with whatever Natural England say, for example. And I just don't feel confidence when you look at the way government works and the sort of lack of cross-department collaboration. I don't feel the confidence that this framework's actually going to set up the country for success in the areas that we need it. And we talked about the planning system earlier. We've ended up with a situation where, when it comes to rural developments, we've got this monoculture of 4 or 5 bedroom homes built on greenbelt, which isn't necessarily what's going to benefit those groups that we talked about. You know, it doesn't allow for older people to downsize, doesn't allow for young people to get onto the housing ladder, and also quite often they're just not very nice, not very attractive, and we've sort of got there because of this culture that we built up of too much bureaucracy. So to me, I think we're better sort of ripping up quite a lot of that and having a slightly more sensible approach to land use, where we are looking at an outcomes based approach rather than kind of looking at it in these nuanced pockets that are then going to lead us to not actually make progress at all in the areas that Britain needs.
Mm. And just in terms of if we go back onto housing, how do you feel about sort of the party movement around house building? Is the grey belt something that Labour's doing that actually you think perhaps is a good thing in terms of land use?
I think we, like, being honest, in the party, having spent conference, I seem to have either been on a rural panel where it's very much about protecting, or I've been on a, like, build panel. There's no sort of in-between, so I don't know which camp you guys are in. Depends on how well you're going to heckle me, I'll know. But I think as a party, we're polarising on this, and the answer really is somewhere in the middle. What we need is very practical options to densify in urban areas. And at the moment, as a developer, why on earth would you do that when you've got councils in London, next to train stations, next to employment, blocking nice, very nice blocks of flats on areas where it actually would benefit you? That is proper brown belt land. And then we're having to build in countryside because actually it's slightly easier from a certainty perspective. So I think as a party, we need to come up with some solutions and be a little bit political about it. Like, we should have built on all the Labour constituencies. We would have benefited economically. We wouldn't have upset all the of our voters in villages and ended up with Lib Dem, which I'm on a council where there's a rainbow coalition. It's the most annoying thing in the entire world, because they don't stand for anything and they are useless. So if we want an example of a lack of strategic direction, visit Rother District, as I'm going to say. So I think, as a party, we need to be a bit bolder, and we need to just be a bit more political and be a bit more ambitious with where we want to go forwards.
Daisy, I could see you sort of nodding along at points there.
Yes, fierce agreement apart from on one thing. So let's start with the thing I disagree on, and then we'll move on to that. The 4 and 5 bed houses. They're incredibly controversial, but actually we published some work earlier this year where we looked at the impact of building big houses, and it turns out that the developers are right, because if you build bigger houses, what tends to happen is that people move from smaller houses into the bigger houses, and it actually frees up a lot of smaller homes. So actually, it turned out the developers were right on that one, which is always fascinating when research throws up unusual results. On the urban densification, I completely agree. I live in South London, and there is a development at the end of my road which is wildly unpopular with absolutely everybody, except for me. And Labour council canvassers keep knocking on my door to tell me how much they oppose the development at the end of my road. And I like to keep a stash of their leaflets to hand to say, but it says you want to build houses. And they say, yes, but not these houses. And I said, oh, just not these ones. Okay, so where are you going to build these 450 homes? And we should be doing a lot more of that. We should be holding their feet to the fire on exactly this stuff. But I actually think, to come back to this point about public goods and what government should care about, government should not be in the business of saying, you should build this kind of home in this place. And it shouldn't be in the business of saying you should do exactly this thing with this field. Because governments don't know about that. And that is tantamount to, don't worry, the man from the government is going to come and sort it out for you. And we all know how comforting that is to hear. But there are a bunch of things that actually we as a government, and Labour as a government now, are failing to deliver on, and that is around the incentives in the public goods. So actually making sure that Elms is sustainable and is actually possible to follow and get money out of, making sure that works would be much more important. And coming from an energy angle, making sure that we actually install the energy infrastructure that we're going to need in order to double our generation capacity over the next decade or so. That is also vital. If we want to build more businesses and more homes in this country, if we want everyone to have the abundance that we all hope for our children and grandchildren, then we need the infrastructure. And we have horribly underinvested in our electricity grid over the last 2 decades, and that is on us as well as on the other side, and we need to make pragmatic, sensible decisions about expanding it now.
Fantastic. I mean, Robbie, what do you make of the calls to be more political, you know, holding Labour's feet to the fire over house building, but also energy infrastructure?
Well, I tell you what, you should come to Keighley, where I'm very robust in holding Labour-run Bradford Council to account. But let me just use that example. So, again, on planning and housing development, we have had, quite rightly, a rollout of local neighbourhood development plans, empowering local parishes to design what their growth strategy is. And I use an example for a village in my constituency, Addingham. They had spent, as a parish, years developing a really good, sound piece of direction to do planning policy, saying that they were willing over the next 15 years to see growth of about 75 houses in their village. But then the council come along with a growth target of the number of houses that they need over the whole district, rather than focusing on need across where the hotspot areas are across the district, on those brownfield sites that should be focused on, they go for quick wins and then say to Addingham as a village, no, we're going to ignore what you said and we're going to allocate 181 houses over the next 15 years to a little village environment, despite all of that work being done. Why? Because they're focusing on greenfield sites. It's a quick win. It's cheaper, less issues to do with contamination, highways issues to get that development going, rather than focusing on where the need requirement has been illustrated across the district, which is generally in the more urban environments or urban fringe areas, or where those brownfield sites exist, where they are sometimes more costly to develop. So I think to unlock those brownfield sites, you need to look at how can you wisely use, in some instances, public sector money to unlock that private inward investment on those more complex sites. And that's where I think we need to have a much more grown-up conversation about, alongside developing sound planning policy.
Yeah, that's great. Roger, I could see you.
Yeah, no, I spend my life at Conservative conferences defending the Greenbelt, so I will have to do it here as well. So I feel like if the Greenbelt wasn't there, we'd want to invent it now. You know, the kind of services, it needs some rethinking for the modern age. But I just want to, at the moment we're doing some work just leading up to the anniversary of the MPPF that shows anything that moves in what's currently designated Greenbelt, whether it doesn't have to be grey at all, is being built on with a proposal for large 4-bedroom homes. So I really agree with Lizzie's point around housing mix. I think that's critical. I think
apologies to anyone in the audience that has a large 5-bedroom home. Yeah, we're not picking on you.
A couple of things. I think one of the things that feels particularly pressing at the moment is the standard method. Very difficult to get people excited about where numbers of houses get built, but it feels critical to what's happening in rural Britain, in particular where the targets for housing have been really, really bumped up without any evidence of a housing need. But I would say that I think, all of our work done both in especially in rural Britain shows that the real crisis in the housing sector is around affordable and social homes. And actually, if we want, the bit where we need to be putting feet to the fire is around the delivery of affordable and social homes. And when you see housing purely in terms as a delivery for growth, you miss that piece of the equation at all. So if we want to build on brownfield land, if we want to see the potential for brownfield to regenerate our towns and cities realise, if we want to give young people their first chance on the housing ladder, then housing isn't just a growth delivery. It has huge economic benefit, but they're not just in the building of homes.
Is that something that you want to touch on, Lizzie?
I was just going to say, going slightly rogue, but in terms of nature, because I think we haven't necessarily lent into that so much. And I think where it comes to housing and food production, have we maybe... are we pushing nature off the table too much, or is nature where do you see the priorities from?
I think the 30% target for nature is the bit that gets pushed to the bottom of the pile every time. So I think there's an opportunity. 70% of our land is still farm, so working in partnership with farmers to think about how they can. I think we're in danger of thinking about a land spare, land share argument. So you do intensively farmed farming in one area, and you leave the rest for rewilding. I don't think that's the answer. I think the answer is, how do you do both? How do we make our land? If we're running out of land, the answer is, and plenty of farmers are brilliant at this already, is how do you deliver nature's recovery and farm in the same place? place, and I think that's what we want to do. I think the same is true in our towns and cities. You know, just one of my real concerns about the new towns proposals, you know, new towns have a really important part to play in the mix, but they should have the ambition that the 50s new towns or Letchworth had around nature as well. So we need to up our ambition on nature on everything. And at the moment, when it comes to land use, nature is the icing, and actually it needs to be the cake.
Yeah, I mean, Robbie, how do you do that through policy?
Certainty. I can't stress that enough. You know, the government, since they've come into power in the last year, have made some catastrophic economic decisions, which is impacting certainty around those farmers that do want to invest and do the right thing on improving the environment. You can't be in a scenario where you're hitting our farming community with a potential IHT liability. First of all, and then removing a sustainable farming incentive applications that are being considered, or then not giving any hope of a clear direction that's then being set, and then bringing out really short-term arrangements, short-term agreements. 3 years is not a long period of time for that margin to be put in place, for the environmental benefit to then be delivered, and then, oh, by the way, we're going to remove the amount of money that is able to be received for that particular option, or remove a capital grant. You can't have this chop and change policy if you're wanting to align certainty with cash flow for increasing food productivity as well as improving the environment.
Because, I mean, Daisy, we've sort of touched here then about farming and housing, but you obviously mentioned energy infrastructure and infrastructure more widely. How do you find the sort of country and political parties getting that balance right?
It's a tricky one because energy is a real flare point at the moment. I don't think it's particularly proportionate. I mean, the proportion of land use for energy is well below 1%, which is substantially below, as many of you may have heard, the amount of land use for golf courses. So it is a tricky conversation to have quite often, which is, I think, in contrast to when you look at what's happening in other nations, where energy is really seen as part of that farm diversification conversation. In the US and in Europe, the onshore wind conversation has been very much more positive, partly because it is seen as one of the tools for helping farms to remain profitable and continue farming in the way that they are proud to farm, but augmented by an additional income source. And that is also really important as we're going to begin to electrify farms more and allow them to become more productive and more efficient and also nicer to work on and less dangerous, importantly. So I think we have allowed that conversation to become too inflamed. I also think quite often in energy there is the possibility of further win-wins to your point about why do we make it either or nature. With energy, quite often, pylon runs and solar fields provide much higher biodiversity than some of the alternative uses. And as one of my focus groups very memorably said recently, it's much nicer than living next to a field of pigs.
Well, Robbie, do you ever have sort of interactions where you're having to, I'm sure you're having to balance what your constituents are coming to you with sort of queries about energy costs while they're bit farmers as well? How do you see balancing those two things?
I mean, I think this builds into the bigger conversation around land use and how what framework are you creating to allow anyone to sweat the asset, so to speak, that they are lucky enough potentially to own, whether it's for energy production or whether it's for food production or whether it's for environmental means. I think it's absolutely right that we set a framework for that to operate within, but we shouldn't be frightened. In my view, food productivity has to be at the heart of government thinking. Therefore, how do you make food productivity more profitable, right, if you're able to do that, so that it is something that is wanting to be utilised for land, so that it's an attractive business that is able to be continuing. Because the reality of it is, where you have other energy-based options, whether it is for putting in an AD plant and you're growing crops to supply the AD plant, or whether it is solar, they sometimes are far more financially lucrative. So there has to be a question about how you make farming much more financially viable in the first place. And the second point being, there's got to be a conversation about how you are utilising land for energy production. Personally, I think we should be absolutely pushing forward on more nuclear-based options. We should not be taking out, in my view, productive arable land or others for large solar applications, because once it's in, it's in. And in my view, we should be very firm on that. And likewise, I also apply that to removing to the scenario where onshore wind farm, the moratorium has been removed. Again, I just reference an application that's literally coming down the pipeline in close to me. It will be the biggest wind farm if it goes ahead in England, but it's on protected peatland. Peat grows at about 1 millimetre a year if you are lucky, right? And once you put the foundations in on protected peatland for the wind turbines themselves, the drainage, all of the cabling, the road network, the environmental damage is far, far greater than whatever the benefit will be from simply having some wind turbines producing electricity. So therefore, you've got to have an energy security strategy that is not then having a negative impact on potentially sweating the asset for food production or enhancing environmental means.
Can I come back on that and steal some of Lizzie's hecklers?
Yes, you can.
Clearly not my home crowd. Sorry, gang. If you want to know something that once it's in, it's nuclear. I mean, I'm very pro-nuclear. We should build nuclear. But to be clear, solar can be moved and is quite a useful way of leaving a field fallow. But also, it takes up quite a lot less land than many of the other unproductive things that we do with our farmland. Most of it is not on productive farmland, and it is remarkably movable. I think making solar the big bad is doing a disservice to a lot of the farming community, it's doing a disservice to our energy security, and it is doing a disservice to our economy.
Roger, I think you wanted to come in on...
Yeah, on solar, yeah. So just go back to George Michael if you're going to do it right. So our objection isn't about... So the climate change is the biggest threat to the countryside, CPRE believes, but I think that the issue for us is both on transmission infrastructure and on mega solar, that some of those decisions are not being made within strategic framework. So take transmission, for example. You could have put the new spine of pylons that goes through Derbyshire down the M1. I think most of us think that running transmission infrastructure along, for I think a like less than 2% difference in price, it's planned to run through the Erewash Valley that has no infrastructure in it at all. So I think, we need to make these decisions in the round. And on mega solar, I think we need to listen to the people who, I was in Botley West a couple of weeks ago where 5 villages are completely surrounded by glass. All of those people, they are not coming from an anti-net zero position. They're coming from a position of saying, this is changing our landscapes for 60 years. That's 2-3 generations. The emotion of those people who don't feel involved in that question, where they know there are different solutions. In Germany, 80% of the solar has been put on roofs because successive governments there have invested. It's the cheapest way to generate energy in Germany. So I think, successive governments have failed to make the most of the rooftop opportunity. And I think if we are going to rethink solar, we need to go back to the drawing board and really think about prioritising rooftop. Every time you drive down a motorway, you see a warehouse, a series of warehouses, none of them have got solar on them. So if we want, we need to generate more, but the where is so critical if we want to take people with us. I think the real challenge on the road to net zero is not what we put in the ground, it's how many people we take with us on the journey.
No, just to chip in again on the drum I keep banging about the bureaucracy. I think because everything is such hard work to do in the UK, we actually end up with having to only do it in large scale. So mega solar, because they're the only companies who can afford to go through all of the red tape. I think, I do actually completely take the point that there is a social impact if you are surrounded by solar panels. But I don't think we would have a problem if they were little bits all over the place, but because of the system that you have to go through, that is not the case. And I was on a panel yesterday about anaerobic digesters, which was a quite difficult one after a heavy night. But actually, there's a real opportunity there for smaller on-farm AD plants. But again, why it's a big risk and it's like a huge hurdle of red tape for an individual farmer to go through. And there's, then they have to manage it, make sure all the health and safety is in place, et cetera, et cetera. So I think my view is if we can sort of mobilise smaller businesses and farmers to be able to do this in like little pockets, I don't think actually our voters would have such a big problem with it.
I mean, Robbie, do you think that's something that you and the party will be looking at doing, making those sort of smaller projects more feasible?
And look, that comes back to the grid connection issue. You know, there are many applications that would have, I suspect, been positively looked at if they could have connected to the grid, whether it be a single turbine or whether it be small-scale solar. But actually, grid connection becomes the ultimate challenge, and therefore, what Lizzie is saying is absolutely right. You end up seeing large-scale schemes come down the line because the larger the scale scheme, it's the contribution to being able to sort the grid connection out in that particular area, and that's the way in which the funding and the model will work that's associated with that. So ultimately, yes, you want to enable a system that is providing flexibility for a landowner to sweat their asset as much as possible. But the infrastructure has got to be sorted out, and grid connection is key as part of that, as well as planning as well, to make it slightly easier.
Perfect. Well, I could sense the audience getting quite into some of the topics at the end, so I think we'll go for questions. We've got a microphone roving around, and if, when you ask your question, if there's someone on the panel you'd especially like to hear from, please do say. There's a lady in a scarf here, just at the front. It should be on.
Hi. It seems to me that we live in Northern Europe, therefore solar is not actually sensible. We are actually in one of the countries that has the lowest efficiency for solar. We are also currently have a wind farm system which is essentially a siphon that takes money from taxpayers and pays it to private equity houses. And I know that for a fact because my son works in the business. How about we ditch the solar in Britain, we ditch the wind farms, which are a complete bloody scam and are not efficient. We use the money to siphon it through overseas aid and build the solar in countries in Africa where it's efficient and use interconnectors to pump it back into the UK system.
Thank you. Robbie, that might be one that you want to
Okay, yeah.
that you might want to touch on.
I generally come back to the point that I said earlier on. I think we have to progress at speed with small nuclear rollout. I think that is absolutely the key way of addressing some of the key energy security challenges that we have right now. I do have a lot of concern around when you're looking at large solar and large wind farm schemes, particularly when really a lot of it is what you're doing is offshoring a lot of the, where you look where they're made. We have no recycling mechanism that properly works associated with turbines. When you look at their average life expectancy, maybe 20, 25 years. You look at a lot of the heads of terms that are agreed with those sorts of applications to do with bringing that ground back into a usable state once that application has come to the end of its life of 20, 25 years. So I'm very sceptical, right, about that route. Having something located in a different country and geopolitical challenges and all that, I think we crack on with nuclear at speed.
Great, thank you. Roger, is that something you wanted to come on in on at all?
The only thing I would come in on is we've got the leakiest housing stock in Europe, and as alongside, so we think about this entirely from a generation and transmission point of view, but let's get our house in order literally in terms of how we build homes, so that we're, we've got the capacity to build zero bill homes at the moment, so why aren't we building more of them? So I think especially for people on lower incomes.
Great, thank you. I'll go for the person that's just next to you.
Thank you. I'm a councillor in North Yorkshire, and I'm proud to have what is called the best view in England from the top of Sutton Bank, according to James Herriot, aka Elf White. Unfortunately, in the pipeline, that view is going to be ruined potentially by 173 acres, which will be covered by battery storage units. No one has yet mentioned the threat of battery storage units on our land, and unlike the lady who said solar panels are movable, these are the equivalent of containers that will ruin the countryside.
I mean, Daisy, is there anything you want to...
Yes, gosh, so much. I was on a panel this morning with someone from the Northeast, and he made, I think, a really valid point, which is that for a really long time, a lot of this is, you're all going to hate me in about half an hour, so I'm just going to dive into that anyway. For a long time, most of this country has been able to enjoy electricity whenever they switched on a light, coal, gas, and it has mostly come out of very specific parts of our countryside, where they didn't have the loveliest view in England. What we have moved to over the past few years, and it was happening when we were burning more gas, is a more decentralised energy system. It's more secure, it's more resilient. The last time, in fact, back in the 2000s and the 90s, when we've procured gas power stations, instead of procuring one or two large ones, the companies are offering us much smaller ones distributed all over the country. So our whole power system has become far more decentralised. And the move to renewables has intensified that. And what that means is that the load is spread more evenly across the country. And I'm sorry, I know some of you have really lovely views, but part of that is because you're used to a lot of the stuff that actually, if you were going back a few years, you would have said was really ugly. A lot of farm buildings are hideous. That's why we don't mind putting solar on them. Batteries do mostly look like containers. There's a lot of containers hiding in most of the countryside as well. There's also a lot of pylons all over the countryside. And the number of new ones that are going in over the next decade is not actually a substantial expansion of that. When the first national grid went in, there was national uproar, and we're all rather used to them now. The amount of complaints I get about solar panels, even on roofs in towns, but people are fine with wheelie bins because they provide us a service.
And just to, I suppose, like really, really zoom out and bring a bit of perspective, I think so I've been meeting as part of sort of one of the other hats that I have with quite a few different countries in Europe. And at the moment, like energy security, we're sort of taking it for granted. But there's going to come a point, hopefully not too soon, where that is an ultimate priority for us and we need to like massively escalate. And I do worry that sometimes we get very, very localized with that, and even sometimes very much focused on like just the UK. And I think actually we need to be very much looking at this from a global perspective and be ready that we can protect ourselves or even help some of our neighbours if the time came when we had to do that.
I think we'll go to the lady here.
Hi, I'm going to play devil's advocate here. I grew up in rural Scotland. We got cut off from electricity for at least a couple of weeks every year. People had Argas to heat their homes. I also worked for an electricity board and was part of supply chain management, developing supply chain management system to keep the grid going, to reduce outages and so on. I now live in South Wales, and where I live, if I look out of my front door, 500 metres as the crow flies is the Heritage Coastal Walk for Wales, and a power station that's being decommissioned. Behind me is MOD Llynathan, which is a massive brownfield site that is not being exploited by the Welsh Government, and the decisions that are being made are horrific, and they're planning to build thousands of houses on greenfield sites when you've got a perfect space there for the housing. And it is just a mess. Now, I've just installed solar panels, I believe, not in macro solutions to the energy. I think we have to have a multi-layered micro approach that's dispersed throughout the United Kingdom, and we need to have a layered approach so that we use different types of green energy, including nuclear. Growing up in Scotland, nuclear was a significant part of my education because it does have a place. And we need to embrace solar, and solar does work in the UK. With my new installation, will create enough energy throughout the year to make money off it in the summer to pay for my bills in the winter, because the roof to my house is south facing, and I have researched, because I've come from an engineering background, the quality of the products that are being installed, the life of the products, and I've also asked what happens when we decommission it, what happens with the waste. And I tried to fit a heat exchange pump, but the Labour-led council will not allow me to do that without an extensive planning thing, because my house is a few centimetres short of the distance to the adjacent property. And yet all the council houses, the social housing, have had these fitted, and they're closer together. It's just ludicrous. It's the tail wagging the dog.
Yeah.
The developers are dictating where the houses are being built. not the councils. The planners need to be educated in green technologies. Please, what are your views on this?
I mean, Roger, do you...
Yeah, I think, I just go back of what we're here to talk about in this session is about land use. And I think what you've done is illustrate to me why the current way we think about land use isn't working, and that we need to sew together some of those different needs of land use, because otherwise some of those decisions don't get made. I agree with you entirely on the decentralizing supply. I also do agree with Daisy that, we've got to think differently. We've got a grid system that's focused on delivering power through big old coal systems that, wherever you put the deadline for climate change, we have to think differently, very, very differently, and it's going to have an impact on infrastructure. But where that stuff goes, it doesn't happen by just having a strategic spatial plan for energy. And I think one of our concerns is it's one aspect. And one of our concerns is having waited for something that joins up land use for 100 years. Now we've got 3 or 4 plans that are spatial in the offing. And I think one of the things we're very keen on is to see how they sew up at a local level. So in your place, you can see what is the potential for that brownfield site for housing, for energy, and for all the other functions. It's not working at the moment, yeah. Yeah, no, I agree.
Do you have solar panel envy, though? Your system sounds great.
And they raise cheaper solar panels as well.
So I'm keen to hear, a lady, this blonde lady here has had her hand up.
Thank you very much. I just got 3 things I wanted to say. First of all, I think it would be fantastic if, when we have a Conservative government again, people are required to put solar panels on big buildings, and like Italy, not allowed to put solar panels on productive agricultural land. I suspect you don't agree with me, but I think that is important. The third thing I wanted to say was, and I'm from Suffolk, which is one of the bread baskets of England, and we are literally surrounded by solar farms. It's not just the panels. It is, as this lady said, the storage containers. There is a major problem with those that if they burst into flames, you can't put them out, and that's very dangerous for people. Nobody can blame farmers for wanting to put solar panels on their land because they make a lot of money, and, it's not for someone like me who isn't a farmer to object to that choice, but we, as the government, when we're back in power, should do something, whatever that may be, so that farmers aren't obliged to destroy their land. And it's not all bad land. It may be said to be bad land by solar developers who send all their profits offshore, but we do need to protect our land, as you've all said, for food security. So thank you for listening.
Thank you. Robbie, would you like to...
Well, so 3 points. First one is yes, more on roofs. And actually, we should go further than that. And where we have got new big industrial sites, it should be part of the planning application approval that they've got to have the solar on the roof. Without a doubt, I think we all agree on that. Second point, totally agree with productive agricultural land should not be subjected to these big, huge schemes, which are now effectively being considered by Secretary of State level rather than even by a local authority. And it's the same for the large wind applications as well. And on the third point, don't disagree at all. I think we were all on the same narrative that we just need to get the structure right that provides, it comes back to the grid connection issue. At the moment, we're dealing with these huge schemes because the system is not allowed to work. If we can get the grid connection working, I think it's right that small schemes could be looked at to help with that increase of productivity on all those businesses, whatever they might be doing, whether it's solar or whether it's wind, a single wind turbine or whatever it might be. But grid connection is absolutely the key challenge on that.
There's a gentleman just behind that lady. Yeah, he's sort of putting his hand up.
Thank you. Thanks. One thing I haven't heard anyone talk about, I'm just curious, and it might be a silly question, is about hydroelectric. We've had one of the wettest summers, we've had one of the hottest summers. We don't have enough, reservoirs, so surely hydroelectric power would be something in the mix to consider. And renewables, I think it's a hoax, actually. I mean, to think about, bringing, you know, trees and logs from Canada to the Drax power station to burn. Surely, you know, nuclear and, you know, hydroelectric would be way more better than some of these kind of other options. Thanks.
Daisy, do you want to touch on hydroelectric?
Yeah, so much to unpick here. Hydro is great in a lot of ways. Do you know a lot of our hydro is owned by Drax? I don't think most people know that. The thing that Drax as a company specialise in is producing renewable energy that is dispatchable. It's not intermittent. And that is one of the reasons that they love hydro. It is also one of the reasons that they have converted what used to be a coal-fired power station. It was then the first power station in the world, coal-fired power station in the world, that put sulfur scrubbers into its chimneys to become the cleanest coal power station in the world, and has then been converted multiple times since and has always been first of a kind. And I think that is something as Conservatives that we should welcome having in our country as people who are trying new things. There have been some slip-ups along the way. However, it remains a really important part of our energy system. And in the next few years, we're going to really need it. Partly because it takes a really long time to build nuclear. And whilst I think we're all in agreement here that nuclear is a good thing, this stuff takes a while. On renewables being a hoax in general, I'm not with you on that. We have some of the best wind in the world. It's a strange thing to be proud of, but I persist in it. Even here in the UK with our terrible weather, solar is... So, sorry, either it's funneling money to PE or it's not making a profit. Which one is it?
The money that goes to PE is the money that comes from the taxpayer, the subsidies.
Yes, I think we might have to take this one offline. But as this lady has already explained, solar does work in the UK despite us not having as much sun as we might like. And the problem with hydro, much though I love it, is that there are limited numbers of sites that work for it. And also that the payback period on it is much, much longer than most of the Treasury's calculations are. So hydro is great in a lot of ways in that it can last for 120 years, given the size of it. However, from the nature point of view, we've increasingly started to worry about the impact of dams on our landscapes. And in general, it doesn't pay back quickly enough because the Treasury looks at 60 years or less.
Oh, I'm terrible. Could we? No, it's all right. It just maybe save it for afterwards so we can hear from more people. Let's go for this gentleman over there.
Yes, sitting here, absolutely fascinated. It's not my subject, and I've learnt so much. And I'm just picking up on what the gentleman over there said about, we suddenly mentioned water. And I'm thinking about the huge population increase we've had in the UK since I was a child. And obviously in Wales, where I used to live, there's massive reservoirs. Is there plans in the UK to put more reservoirs in? And this is
yes.
But this is another use of land that is so precious to us. So is that just a yes answer?
Yes, they are planning more, they are building more. We didn't do it early enough. They don't take up that much land, would be my summary.
We'll go for this gentleman here.
Thank you. Jeff Mitchell from Carlisle. My problem is with planning. Carlisle area is coming to the end of a local plan, 2015-2030. After 2015, when the plan was now in place, permission was given for the building of a new garden village, which is going to be 10,000 houses built in the next 30 years. Now, developers are still saying that the local plan says I can build on these pieces of land. Can we not make sure that a local plan that may be in force can be changed after it's put into use, and therefore make my little village is no longer a little village. It's got a 112 house development ongoing at the moment. The same developer has built on 2 other entrances to the village, and we're no longer a little village. Thank you.
Thank you. Roger.
Yeah, I mean, you might be forgiven for thinking that planners are the root of all evil when sometimes I look at some of the headlines recently, and it feels to me that it's not planners that are the problem. Actually, planners are the solution in this. And I think, actually the system we've got around local plan, I think holding on to the idea that you have a local plan that balances land use, that thinks about where things should go in the right place, is really, really important as the needs for what happens on land grow. Now, I think some of the big mistakes that come from land is that the targets are wrong. They've been given the wrong target for the number of houses they need to build in the area. They're not reflective of local need, the wrong infrastructure in the wrong place. That is not often the mistake that's a real challenge for a planning department that may have had its income halved in the last 10 years and is working on a real threadbare thing. So I don't think it's planning that's the problem. I think we need to hold on to our planning system, which is one of the best in the world, and cherish it, because it's the key to delivering some of these multiple challenges around land use.
Robbie, is there anything that you want to pick up on from that?
I'm going to go back to the water question, because I think just simply to say yes isn't good.
We can give you more.
Illustrating, actually, I mean, the system's broken, I'm going to have to say, right? There's not enough of a debate around water security and water resilience in this country. We've just had the biggest drought going, and there's going to be more drought and more challenges coming down the line with population growth, producing food, etc. The way in which the system works at the moment is an over-reliance on water companies to build water storage predominantly, paid for through the PR24 negotiations that take place with government and Ofwat, and how much the water company is able to spend relative to the water bill payer, right? And we see the planning system is broken. It's not able to cope with these big schemes, and therefore water storage is not being built at the speed in which it needs to for this country. I think there needs to be a much more innovative policy thinking on this space, which is using private landowners, incentivised, whether it's through capital allowances or tax incentives, to build their own water storage for their own usage if they're a food producer, but build that water storage at a much bigger scale, therefore holding water, so smaller schemes, you know, compared to like the big Fens reservoir that's going to be built in Cambridgeshire. But therefore, water storage is then taking place much, much more so across the country, and therefore, why not think about a system of then, if you're storing water on your land, you're then paid as a landowner to release that water back into a water grid. A little bit like we have the same scenario with the electricity grid when you're incentivised through feed-in tariffs between 2010 and 2015 to put your own electricity generation on farm. I think we need to be looking at this much, much, much more innovatively, so that it almost is driving private sector investment much more so in dealing with the water resilience issue.
Wasn't there
storage centres? We've got these, and they're building storage centres all over the place, and they're going to need water. And all the rest of it, and it's just no one ever discusses it. It's like,
I think I was going to say, isn't there I think this has come from Simon Clarke, so you know, I'm sure there's data behind it. But didn't we last build a reservoir when Oasis released their first single or something? It's it's really dismal.
It's madness.
Yeah.
I think we'll take that lady just at the back there with the green lanyard.
Thank you. Rafi from the RSPB. The panel have mentioned nature, so I just have a question for Robbie and the Shadow DEFRA team on this. We know wildlife is in deep decline in the UK, and previous Conservative governments have done a number of things that have been hugely welcome in terms of trying to restore nature. But it's really worth emphasising that we cannot tackle nature loss in this country without hand-in-hand action to tackle climate change. We're already seeing flooding, drought and wildfires taking their toll on our nature reserves and our species. The UK State of Nature report shows that climate change is a key pressure affecting particularly our wildlife at sea and around our coast. And the British public knows this. Polling shows that people's biggest worry about the impact of climate change in the next 10 years is the effect on nature and wildlife. And, you know, we're a nation of nature lovers, so people are very concerned. And yet, you know, we do have this proposal around scrapping the Climate Change Act. So my question is, how is the party planning to square this circle and protect British wildlife whilst kind of rowing back on climate action?
You have to bring the public along with you. Right, there's a real challenge that if you're not taking a pragmatic and a realistic approach in reaching net zero, you are not going to bring the public along with you. And if you are leading it, if there's a real challenge that is leading to much higher cost of doing so to your average individual out there through increased electricity bills, whatever it is, then you are not bringing the public alongside. So I think it's the right direction to be taking that much more pragmatic and realistic approach. And to build on that, I think it also, you mentioned wildfires, so I just want to focus specifically on that point, because the government in the last week, 2 weeks, made the most disastrous decision to ban controlled burning of heather on moorland. Absolutely will have a huge negative impact on wildlife, on our peatlands through increased wildfires that are now taking place. I was up on the North York Moors just 2 weeks ago, where it's still on fire, and that was a tool in the armoury of most of our land managers to be able to carry out controlled burning of heather on moorland on deep peat. That is a wrong decision of this government to have taken, and I urge them to change it before it's too late, before it can be challenged up until the 10th of November, and we will certainly be doing that as a Conservative Party. It will not be good for conservation in the long run.
I know Robbie has to run to another panel, so I thought we'd do closing remarks from speakers. If Roger, if you wanted to say anything, and you can feel free to go and run to your next one if you want.
Go down our final.
Okay.
Yeah.
Should we start with Daisy then instead? Is there anything that you want to end on?
It's been such a varied conversation.
A quick takeaway.
Actually, I'm going to take this point about taking communities with us, because it's something we say a lot. And also, I think we treat the status quo as if it's written in stone. The system we have didn't grow up from the ground. It is not natural. We created it. Successive governments created it. That is true of our planning system. It is true of our current land use. It is also true of the way in which we put together energy bills. So our climate action so far and the way in which we subsidise nature recovery within farming, for example, those are choices that government has made. And the way in which we transfer those onto bills and in taxes are also choices that governments make. What we have talked about today is the choices that government makes in order to set the direction for land. And I would argue that we are not currently making those in a wise way, as the frustration in this audience tells, but that we need an adaptable approach that allows for climate action, the energy abundance we need to grow in this country, and also protects nature in our communities.
Lizzie.
Yeah, I know I have to be really brief. I think my kind of key point to hammer home today is variety. I think we're all angry by monocultures, whether that's solar panels, whether that's large housing developments. We just need to find a system that means we can have little bits of everything and a real kind of sense of that variety. And then I think we will actually achieve what we need to do in terms of development and making the landscape and the countryside work for us and work for the country, but without obviously losing the community buy-in.
And Roger, if there's anything you want the audience to take away.
Yeah, I think every time we have a debate about land use, we end up talking about the component parts of land use, and I think the really hard thing is to talk about how it comes together. And I think you're all really passionate about different elements of how land use is used. And, you know, it was a Conservative government that brought forward the idea of a land use framework. I really hope that we see the Conservative Party enthusiastic about the sew-up together. You might have views about how it's done, but I think, I'm trying to get my mother excited about land use frameworks, and I failed. But I think because she does exactly what's happened today, she talks about mega solar and she talks about the housing mix and she talks about the component parts. The hardest thing to get right is what does this look like on the ground and how do we do the trade-offs, because this is all about trade-offs and thinking about how we can have, you know, deal with those incredible threats coming at us with climate change at the front of the queue and how we can manage them together.
And I just wanted to say thank you so much, audience, for your thoughtful questions, and to the panel for your contributions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.